at the church now, which used to be the Roseville Telephone Building, and it was by everyone in the telephone industry, it was always called the Taj Mahal because it was such a big fancy building for Roseville Telephone. But when you go in, and I believe the sanctuary is off to the left there?
Yes.
Okay. Where you go in the doors to the sanctuary, is there a room on the left-hand side?
There is.
That was my wife's office.
That's where we actually control the editing for the service.
Yeah.
And there's an elevator right there in front of it.
Yep.
That's hidden, and then there's a room behind there.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah. So that was her office right there. She was originally over here off Yosemite before that was built, and property maintenance was out there. She worked for the property maintenance division, but now. So yeah, and I started in the wireless. So there was Roseville Telephone, and then they started a wireless portion in They actually started planning for it like 95. They started it in 99, and it was called RCS Wireless. And so I started there, and we kept all of our equipment out there, trucks and everything, and the vehicle department. What's now the gas company back out there. So that was the vehicle department where they did all the work on the trucks, and the gas pumps there were for all the company vehicles to store. And we stored our generators there and all of our stuff for wireless out there. And we actually started the corner here where there's a smoke shop, that little corner. So that little corner was the wireless office. So we started over in there. So you were talking about your grandmother, calling your grandmother on the phone. It's the first time I came in here, this little yellow timer down here, you see the yellow phone? My grandmother had that exact timer, and she had it sitting next to her phone, and she had a pad of paper. So when she would call her sister, who lived in Idaho, she would call, and she would turn the timer over, and she would talk to her, and when it went down, she'd mark it on the paper, and she'd turn it back over. She'd mark it on the paper, and she'd get to 5 minutes, and she'd say, okay, I have to go now, she'd hang up. Then when her bill came, she would look at the date that she wrote down and how many minutes, and make sure that it matched what was on the bill, and keep track of everything. So every time I see that, I think about her sitting there at the phone, turning the timer over. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things that we have in here, and things that I see, and I remember that now. I was born in 71, so around the same. And I was looking at that red phone right there, and you see the lock on the phone? All of our phones at school had those locks on them to call without having a teacher unlock the phone. So that's another one of those memories that came out that I had never thought of, and then it's like it jogs memories that you had in your past. But so this little portion is just for the telegraph, preceding the telephone, and there's a little story about Morse code and how it came around and everything. So Samuel Morse was an artist and a sculptor, and he just liked he liked making things and tinkering and stuff like that. And he was in Europe, and he was looking at art galleries in different places, and the electromagnet had become very popular. Gauss, I believe, was the one that invented the electromagnet. And so it was the new fancy thing, right? So everybody was trying to figure out things to do with electromagnets. And he was watching this exhibit on electromagnets, and these are electromagnets, and inside this box is a battery, and this is basically just a contact that closes the circuit. So when the power is put to the windings, it creates a magnet, and it pulls this armature down. You can see it move, right? So he's watching this, and he's thinking to himself, I can make it so that I can send messages back and forth with this thing. Well, other people in Europe were doing the same thing at the time, trying to figure out how to use it. So they just extend the wire out from it to a sounder at the other end. So in here, you see the sounder move at the same time. And the bigger the battery and the bigger the wire, the longer the distance you could go. So he came back to New York in 1832 and filed a patent for a telegraph machine. And he had a friend named Alfred Vail, who was an electrical engineer. And so he got him to help him work on this machine. And they came up with it. And originally there was a piece that looked like a clock, kind of. It had gears and armatures and windings. It was a very intricate, pretty thing. And it had a spool of paper on it. And the armature had a pin sticking up. And the spool would start to turn. And when you pressed down once on the key in contact, it would punch a hole in the paper. And if you held it down, it would stick up and the paper would drag across it and it would create a line. So you get a dot and a dash. So he used dots and dashes to come up with the code for Morse code. So he also wanted to figure out how to make it work as quickly, and efficiently as possible. So to create the code, he went to a typesetter and he looked at the typesetter's letter keys. And he looked at which letters were more worn down than others. And the ones that were worn down farther, he gave them shorter dots and dashes or shorter, code. The ones that were not used as much, he gave them longer, so that it would make it faster to send the messages back and forth. Yeah. So he had the machine all done and running, and they opened their company in 1836, and it was called the Morse Telegraph Company, and it was one line from Philadelphia to New Jersey, and that was the entire company. And everyone was amazed, and they thought it was great. And the railroads found out about it, and they said, "We have to have this because we have lines already in. We can put the poles up right next to our railroad lines. We can maintain it from the railroad. We know when trains leave, when they should arrive. We can keep track of everything on a very tight schedule. We know when to switch tracks, that kind of thing." And they even had portables that were in the train, so they could stop the train, or if it broke down, they could get out and reach up with a long stick, and they could clamp onto the wires and send a message from there back to the next station or to the station previous. And so they purchased the company, and from then on, Morse went back to doing art because that's what he was. He was an artist, and he was never really known for anything else in his life other than Morse code. And so that was kind of his 15 minutes of fame, if you will, was the Morse code. Nikola Tesla, his work was with magnets and electromagnetic electricity, and he believed correctly that you could transmit electricity wirelessly and just pull it out of the air. And in computers, all power is just a certain wavelength and frequency. So everything from your heartbeat to microwave radio to electricity to lightning, it's all just a different frequency and a different wavelength. So he was on the right track. He just got overrun by others. If Tesla had been able to get his inventions out and continue on with his stuff and hadn't been pushed down by Edison and the electric companies, we would all probably have wireless electricity at this point. So you can look up stuff like Earth. There's Earth batteries, where you can build Earth battery, and it's basically a container, and it's just the two sides contact. It's in the ground. Connect them together, and you get enough of them in series, and it'll put out 12 volts, 24 volts. You can run them to a battery. It will charge a battery. You can run an inverter off of it and run electricity off of it, and it's just battery powered out of the ground. A couple of different ones. So there's one I've seen that works with magnets, and they repel, and so it's almost like opposing pistons, like a Volkswagen engine, the Boxer engine. And once you get it going, as it goes, the magnets repel each other, and so it goes to one end, and it gets to a point where it can't take it, and it pushes it back, pushes the magnet to the other end, and then back and forth, and that continues to turn a crank, and it's basically a perpetual motion machine. It just continues and continues and runs. And as long as there's not so much load on it that it can't make the thing. I've also seen the same thing done with springs. So you have springs on a offset crankshaft and a heavy weight. Once you get the weight going, the springs start pulling back and forth against each other, and it just continues to run. And I've seen them run pumps for fields and small generators and stuff like that off of the same kind of thing.
That's funny because Talk about the analog, because that's interesting.
Okay, so when I started doing wireless, it was all analog phones. So at that time, when you made a phone call, your phone, your analog cell phone, was really just a radio. It was a radio phone. And so when you called, it would select a line for you in the cell site, and you had a channel card that was set to a certain frequency channel, and an amplifier and a tuning cavity that could be tuned to different frequencies for that. So when you called, you would get that one line. So you took up one slot in the cell site, and that would go out over went to what was called a channel bank, and that was a multiplexing and demultiplexing of a T1 line, which is
I got it.
T1 is 3.14 megs. So it would split out. T1 had 24 DSOs, 24 lines on it. So you could have 24 channels simultaneously in a cell site on one T1. And that was a normal cell site. So moving forward, when it switched to digital, you had one card that would run 72 calls. So back in analog, when you were traveling, when you did a handoff to another cell site when you were moving it, the sound would change. Sometimes it'd be staticky, sometimes it'd not, because it was all this analog, and the frequencies weren't exactly the same because tuning cavities had to be changed all the time. If an amplifier had a problem, it was buzzing. It would get real loud on one call, it'd be faint on another, that kind of thing as you went through. When they went to digital, they went to soft switching is what they call it. So your phone call actually will float between multiple sites, and it may drop off another, and you're still connected to two others, and it may pick up a third, and then you drop off that one. Or if this one is at capacity and you're on another, it's selective. It'll drop you off so someone else can use this line. So one card used to do 72 calls. Then they went it just up and up from there. And now phones are just a network device. They're not really a phone anymore. It's just a computer with a communication port. You know. Had asked me, so when they sent messages with it, so they said, well, how far can you send a message? Well, it depended on the size of the battery that you had, size of the wire, how clear the line was to go. But they were generally just town to town, or they would have relay stations in between. So if you wanted to send a message, say like from here to New York, right? To me, it's the same. You're familiar with networking and all that, so the 7 layers IP. It's the same thing that they did back then. Is basically how when you send an email now, it says this is the IP I originated from. This is the next one in line. This is the one I'm going to. It's the same thing with this. This is Sacramento. I'm calling to Auburn for a message for New York, and then we would send the message out. Auburn would respond back. I received all the bits of information. I received the message. I'll send you a receipt when the message has been sent, and then they would send it to the next one, and the next one, the next one, get back, and then they would hear back that message sent, reply back to me, the message was sent, same way your email does in milliseconds. Then it was all going down the line, person to person. That aren't that old. Actually, cell phone, radio, telephones. They were all the way back into the 40s. So the first ones were in cars because they were 90 pounds and went in the trunk of the car and stuff. So the cell phones have been around for a long time. The first mobile handheld phone call was in 1974. And that's considered the first cell phone call. But it's really not. It happened way back in the 40s before that. And before that, the military used it. So it's been around for a long time. It just...
And NASA as well, I think.
Yeah. So that's that was through the battery because it was self-powered, and it had a magneto that would power the ringer that would sing back and forth. And it was one line. I mean, when you picked it up, the line connected to was connected to the switchboard. So they went from that to the ones that you could actually dial, and that's the step switch in there, where it goes through going along. But I can kind of tell from the look of the phone, the era of it, but they didn't all keep up with each other, and everywhere had some a little bit different. Definitely like rural areas like this kept the line switch up until the 50s, I think, 50s or even a little bit later than that, before they went to dial, when other places already had dial switches and everything else. So what would happen if somebody called from there to here, they would call and it would go to the operator, and the operator would have to manually, connect up to more rural places and stuff. So outlying took a lot longer to catch up to everyone else, with their technology. All the way up until, when was it, 80s, somewhere around in there, early 80s. You couldn't buy a phone. You rented the phone from the phone company. And if you wanted a phone, it was, I still remember a conversation my grandfather was having when he was on the phone with the phone company. And they were verifying information for their records and everything like that. So they called him and they said, "Do you have a colored phone?" And he said, "Yes." They said, "Well, what color is it?" "It's black." They're like, no, is it a colored phone?" "Yeah, it's black. It's a black phone." Well, so a normal black basic phone cost you like 25 cents a month to rent from them. If you wanted a color, it was 35 cents a month or something like that. If you wanted a princess phone or a different, fancy phone, it was even more, stuff like that. So just those little tiny things, The gray one on the wall right there, actually the gray and the red, but those block. My grandparents had one of those, and it was black, and I still have the phone. And it's got to weigh 15 pounds. And the handset on it, you could probably use to hammer nails in it. More like clockmakers made them than the more basic stuff that, like the Western Electric phones, the ones that we had here. They were always just really pretty ornate. The wood was carved and stuff like that. So for the phones like those, the wall dial and even some of the others, those are like around the 60s. I can't remember when I went to push button. I think I went to push button in. It was the only game in town too, wasn't it? It was, yeah, like the late 70s or right around 80. That's when they introduced tone dialing, and they had the push button phones. But the full kind of look, and a lot of them are the Bakelite phones. These ones are the candlestick. That was the thing in the 20s. That was the candlestick phone. 40. Here's 40. So they all kind of had the same kind of look, and really, really heavy, very, very sturdy phones. The 50s is when they went from the fabric cord to just a regular. The thing is that before they went to switches, the power came from your phone, right? So there's a big battery, big magneto in the phone. When they went to the step switch, your phone is actually powered by the switch. So there's massive battery backup there. So if you lost power, your phone still worked. And people didn't realize that it's actually negative 48 volt charge on a phone. So it'll get you good. We used to, on new guys that had just started, we used to tell them that the easiest way to strip the wire was to eat your teeth. Because it fit right in the gap of your teeth, so you just strip the wire, and then off out of that when you bit down on it. Yeah, I remember, you talking about vacuum, I remember grabbing the vacuum from my grandmother to go move it, and grabbing the cord and get the crap shocked out of me because, the cord. But it was about the 50s when they went from the old fabric style to the plastic style, plastic did that. So interestingly enough, I was watching her one day, when she was over at the office there in the church, and her cord was twisted in this tied up rat's nest mess. And I said, "How do you do that? How do you do that?" She's like, "It's just the cord, it just does it." Okay, so I was watching her one day, we were sitting over there talking, and she answered the phone several times. And she picked the phone up, and then she would put it in her other hand and hang it back up with this hand. So every time she would put one twist in it, and this thing twisted like a rat's nest. It worked great when you first got it, but even after a few days of it turning, it wouldn't make as good a contact anymore. But yeah, I was just, I couldn't figure out, I'm like, I don't understand how you do it, because I picked the phone up and put it back down. And I'm like, how do you twist it up? Do you like swing it around in here when you're bored or something? But yeah, every time she picked it up, put it in her other hand and hang it up. So she would twist it as she went gone.
So here's my,
From the 40s, which they were all kind of the same size, the same weight, same, you know, they were very similar. And then into the 50s, when you got to where they started trying to make them nice. So the teens and 20s, or very late teens to 20s, were the very ornate ones, more of the cradle phones, the candlestick phones. They had chrome on them. They had, you know, gilded, there's brass ones, you know, stuff like that. Then when they went 30s to 40s, it went to just basic, here's your phone, you know, that kind of thing. It was just, they were black.
so
Yeah. And then in the 50s, they started changing a little bit and going back to trying to make them, you know, more of a decorator piece and stuff like that. And so they got a little bigger or smaller, like even that was from the 40s, but they would do, you know, different accent colors and things like that, add to it. And then in the 60s, 70s, it's like you get the Ericsson phones that were very futuristic looking, that had the dials on the bottom, or the Princess phones that have the dials. So that's when they started.
cool, thank you. And then
The benefit to the bag phones, and they were actually, the bag phones were fantastic because, for one, you could use them in the car, plug in your cigarette lighter and use it, but they were 5 watts output, and so they worked all over. I had a friend who had one, and we used to go four-wheeling up at Rubicon, in Desolation Wilderness and everything up there. And with 5 watts output, he could reach a tower and call from the middle of nowhere up there. And then when they went to the handheld ones, they went to a 3/4 watt phone. So it considerably, you know, dropped the area that you could cover with them. And then it's funny because they went from that, they got smaller, till all the way down to the super slim razor, you know, that were so thin you put it in your pocket and never even see it and stuff. And then now we're getting bigger and bigger because the screens are getting bigger and everything else. So,
yeah.
so my favorite of those was when they came out with the little StarTAC, because the StarTAC had a very small internal battery. So you could change the battery without shutting your phone off. It had a little battery that snapped to the back of it, and you could change that. So I had several of them charged because, you know, working out in the field, we were constantly on the phones with the switch and everybody else. And so you could swap it out without even losing your call. And they were basically very simple. So I would go by the showrooms, and any of the broken ones that got turned in, I'd pick those up. So if something happened to mine, I could just fix it in the field, and then the phone still worked. You know?
That's funny.
So, actually a programmer for the state, but he was very, very, very intelligent, and all of us, none of us went to school for anything. But, you know, he went to college. He actually did go to college, but he was always in arguments with his professors because he said, "I don't need to stay in your class. Let me take the final and just move on." And so he would, some of them would say, "Okay, if you think you can do it, you take the final." So he'd take the final and he'd pass. And then some of them would say, "You know, you're going to sit through my class through the whole thing." And so